All right, well, hi everyone. Welcome to Leading with Empathy and Allyship, a live event podcast series. I'm your host, Melinda Briana Epler, founder and CEO of Change Catalyst, where we build inclusive innovation through training, consulting, and events. In the series, we go deep, we get real, we build empathy, and explore tangible, actionable steps we can all take to be better allies and advocates for each other. So I'm excited to welcome Daralyse Lyons, creator of the Demystifying Diversity podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. Yeah, it's wonderful to be joining you.
Yeah. I'm just going to do say a few logistics, and then we'll jump into the conversation. And hello, Fabienne. Thanks for introducing yourself. Open and tired. Yeah. I hear you. So on screen, we have an ASL interpreter, Kalina. Our interpreters are sponsored by Interpreter Now. It's a deaf-owned company we're really proud to partner with. We also have live captioning. If you want to turn on live captioning, go down to the bottom of your screen and just click closed caption. And Maggie is behind the scenes typing away. Thanks to our team, Renzo, Sally, Antonia, and Juliet, who, among many other things, are monitoring the Q&A. And as I mentioned earlier, we do have a code of conduct, but you all seem to be awesome. And we don't really, you have your own code of conduct. So share your aha moments, please. Use the chat as often as possible. And so we know what's going on with you, what you're thinking about. It helps us kind of change the conversation. And then if you have specific questions for us, we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. All right. So Daralyse is a writer and author of more than 20 books, right?
Yes.
She has her own podcast. She's a consultant, a coach, a speaker, a journalist, an actress. You're busy.
Yeah.
And you're changing the world. Yeah. So let's start by talking about your approach to diversity work. How do you approach this? How do you approach this work?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think I know some people may be on the phone, or some people may be just sort of listening in and might not be able to see me, but I'm biracial, and so you asked the question about how do I approach this work, and I think how I approach this work is very similar to how I've always approached my life, which is that I've sort of been able to hold this spectrum understanding of race for my entire existence. And I've had a lot of practice, right, at being kind of asked uncomfortable racial questions and sort of like having to deal with these things at a very early age. And so I think that for me, this work just feels so inescapable, because what I've realized as I've gotten older is that other people aren't having these conversations, and other people aren't necessarily sort of engaging with these things in a way that I've always had to engage with them. But also, I think as a result of being biracial, and I'm also a member of the LGBTQ community, I think like it's in some ways made it so that I've been really attuned to other people's struggles as well as my own. And I've always like sort of looked for areas of intersection and overlap. And so I would say that's how I approach my specific work, which tends to deal not just with one subset of diversity, but with the interconnectedness of oppression and the ways in which we can all sort of work to liberate ourselves and then also liberate others from a space of community and connection and empathy.
There's a lot you said there, just like at the end. Well, could you talk a little bit about, you've talked in the past about, the need for people to be personally invested in this work, and what that means, what that looks like. How do we become personally invested, and how do we get others to become personally invested?
Right. I mean, I think it can't come from an academic understanding of these issues. And don't get me wrong, I think it's important to know sort of statistics and just information and the ways that diversity really, or lack of sort of diversity initiatives really impacts people's lives. I think it is important to know the data. But what I find is that really once people start to connect with other people in a way that is emotional and real and maybe visceral, it becomes kind of impossible to disengage at that point. And so, I'll give an example from my own life and my own work that's connected to me. So in the Demystifying Diversity podcast, I did a series of interviews about Islamophobia in America. And I, as a person, I consider myself to be very sort of aware and attuned and all these things, but I just did not really know or understand how impactful so much of what is happening in this country is on a daily basis, and how people are being, targeted and victimized. And I sort of knew it in a general way, but I wasn't as present to it. I wasn't as attuned to it. And after sitting down with people and hearing their stories and hearing about people dying as a result of other people's hatred, it's made me take such an active role in that specific part of the diversity fight, which hadn't been part of I didn't see it as part of my fight until after I did those interviews. And so I think that's just an example of how becoming, really sitting down with another human being and finding that space for empathy and that space for connection, I think it awakens us to what's not working in the world, and it makes me more personally invested.
I think we might come back to that in a minute, because I want to talk about the election. It's at the forefront of a lot of Americans' minds, and I think globally as well, because there's a huge global impact in who becomes president of the United States. And
absolutely,
global impact in so many ways, from politics to climate and everything in between, right? And
yeah.
And so one of the results is that we have a Black Indian American biracial woman in the White House. So let's start there. How does that make you feel?
Yeah, well, I think it's phenomenal. And also, ageism is a huge problem in the space of diversity. And so we also have our oldest ever president and a biracial woman, taking office. And so I think both of those things are very, very exciting in terms of opening up the possibilities. And representation is so important. And so for little girls sitting at home who see Kamala Harris on screen and suddenly their viewpoint of what is possible for them becomes more expanded, I think that's really, really important. So I would say that those things are, to me, are really meaningful, but also what I find to be incredibly meaningful and important. The work that I do is nonpartisan. It's I don't want to take a political stance, but in my journalistic work and in my reporting, there have just been so many abuses that came out of the current administration, and that, so many comments that Trump specifically made that marginalized people and that led to a lot of hate crimes and victimization of individuals. And so for me, I believe that whoever is in a position of leadership and is in a position of power, their words and their actions are very important, and they say a lot about the values of the American people and the American public. And so I'm just very grateful that I think people that espouse my personal and professional values are in the White House today, or will be at least in January.
Yeah. So you were talking earlier about making those personal connections. And one of the things that came out of the 2016 election was the need for us to really better understand each other. And I think that, I don't know that we did that. I think we actually got more polarized. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts of advice for people in organizations where they're looking to unify their teams right now after such a
Yeah.
divisive election?
Yes. So I think something that is really important is to make it as personal and as granular as possible. I think one of the things that is really challenging is that often what we're seeing is people sort of taking to social media to vent their frustrations or to voice their viewpoints. And there's a level of disembodiment to that, right? Like you can see something behind a computer screen and then like or cancel or unfollow in a way that just tends not to be as likely, right? If you're sitting with someone that you've actually seen every day for the last 3 years and like shared cups of coffee with, like to have a conversation with that person it's gonna be way, I think, more engaged. And I think the investment in the relationship is a lot more profound than something as disembodied as social media. So I think the first step for corporations is to begin to have those conversations, ideally in a one-on-one setting. I personally advocate for first, before sort of taking it into a larger setting, whether that be like a group meeting or making a company statement, which I think can be very important in terms of unifying people behind a certain mission and brand integrity and authenticity. But I think first you want to kind of start by taking the pulse of where people are. And what I really appreciated, Melinda, was that you asked at the beginning of this session, like, how are people feeling, right? And so just taking that time to really check in with people and not assuming that we know how people are perceiving certain things or what their political leanings or their thoughts and feelings might be, because the truth is you don't really know until you take the time to ask and be with someone.
Yeah. Let's talk about a little bit more about your experience as a biracial woman. How does that, can you go deeper into how that affects your life and your work?
Absolutely. So I have two very concrete moments, vivid moments from my childhood. And one is, I remember my mother joined an interracial couples and parents group. And so it was all of us kids were sitting in a room and we were sort of taken to the side by a group facilitator. And all of us children we both had one Black parent and one white parent, and we were asked to identify our race. And the facilitator went around the room and every child identified as Black. They all identified as their minority race. And when the facilitator got to me, I said, "Oh, I'm biracial." And she said, "No, but what are you really?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm biracial." And she's like, "Yeah, but you're Black." And I was like, "Yes, absolutely. And I'm also half white, like I'm both." And she said, "Well, society is not going to see you that way." And I said, "Well, I think the problem isn't in me. I think the problem is in society." And I think, I thought that at maybe, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old. And I feel like that's really been a defining feature of my work, because I do feel like it is so important for people to be able to self-identify. And there are many people who have my same racial and ethnic background who choose to identify as their minority race. And I think there are reasons for that. And I don't sort of pretend to know what's best for any person. But I do think that when we start allowing ourselves to be defined by society and by other people's expectations of us, I think that's a huge problem. And I think that really, a lot of this is about allyship, but I think that's one thing that people can do if they really want to be allies, is not to sort of superimpose our own definitions onto other people, but to ask open-ended questions about, tell me how you see yourself. Tell me what's important to you. Like, how can I honor your sense of self, not superimpose my own, beliefs onto you? And we're seeing a lot of that with issues of gender, right? Like that is really coming to the forefront about people being misgendered. And even in journalism, there's a lot of that. So that stands out as one thing. And I feel like I should let you ask questions before I tell you the second thing.
No, go for it. Okay. Tell the second one. I'm curious.
Sure. Well, so the second story, I was at the Boys and Girls Club in Greenwich, Connecticut. I was 11, 12 years old. I was in middle school. And I was just sort of on the grass, like hanging out with some friends, and I heard just out of the corner of my ear, there was a young Black boy and a white girl. And I heard the girl call the boy the N-word. And I stormed over, like just stormed over. And I said, like, what did you just say? Like, I can't believe that you said that. And I turned to him and I said, like, like, are you going to do anything to this girl? And he's like, no, like, I can't, like, I can't hit a girl. And I said, well, I can. And it's the first and only like fight I've ever been in. But I punched this girl and we got in a fight, and the administration called my mom, and my mom came to pick me up. And and when I got, like, I sort of, the administration was like, well, she was wrong for saying what she did, but also you were like, we're not allowed to just like fight people here. And I got in the car with my mom on the drive home, and I said, like, oh gosh, am I in trouble? And she says, no, Dara, like, I've never been more proud of you in my whole entire life. And I think, like, not that I condone violence, but I think I see myself a lot still in that role, is like, how can I step in? How can I do something when I see something that's not right? When I hear something that's not right, like, what role can I play in supporting other people who might not either have the perception of agency or might not choose to, like, it's just a lot of burden often on the person who is being wronged. And I think sometimes I just want to, like, step in and support when and if I can.
Yeah. Allyship can happen. It's allyship, right? It's stepping in, stepping up. And I think it's time that we're all allies for each other. Regardless of our backgrounds and identities. Just looking at some of the comments in the chat, Fabienne says, I've been thinking this year more that if we move towards the conversations that we were taught to steer away from, we can build a deeper understanding of personal lived experiences and knowledge. Yeah. I think that's so key. And I think it's interesting that in the comment you spoke about being taught to steer away from these conversations. And I think often one of the most impactful things that people can do is to have conversations like these within their families, like where often that elemental learning happened about, oh, we just don't go here. This just isn't, our fight or whatever it is. Because I think what we're seeing a lot with things like cultural competency and racial literacy is that the earlier the conversations can happen, the better equipped people are in order to deal with the current landscape, whether that be from a space of, like, being a person who is marginalized or not. Like, I think the more that we can engage in these conversations, the better. So I always encourage people to have these conversations with their families and their loved ones and their friends, and go to the places that are uncomfortable, because I think the zone of discomfort is the zone of allyship, like that voluntary discomfort, right? Because being comfortable is a privilege. And so if you have this sense of like, oh, I don't necessarily want to do this, or like, oh, like, it's more comfortable not to, like, just take a step outside the comfort zone, because I think that is true allyship. And it's meaningful, and it will deepen those relationships, certainly. Yeah, absolutely. There's another comment I think that's important. Stephanie says, Alfonso David of the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, has talked about the hierarchy of identities and how it can change situations. And that also brings up intersectionality, right? Your intersectional identities as well as your biraciality.
Yeah, and I think these imagined ladders of worth are really what's keeping white supremacy alive and vibrant, is this idea that somehow, I think identities are meaningful, but I also think they're all intersectional. And I think that we can't subscribe like value to identity. It just is an aspect of yourself, and it's an important aspect of who you are, but it doesn't make you any more or less valuable. And so I think that this idea that we have to kind of rank people and rank ourselves is so problematic. And it really leads to, I mean, I think there's a book, a really phenomenal book called Dying of Whiteness. And I think there's a lot of work out there that really shows that it's not only alienating to sort of rank someone below you, it's not only alienating to that person, but it's alienating to you, because it leads to this false sense of separation and isolation. So nobody wins when we're ranking people according to a hierarchy.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that often that happens in diversity, equity, inclusion work internally in companies too, where companies say, well, we're gonna focus on women right now, or we're gonna focus on women and Black and Latinx folks, but not thinking about those intersectional identities that, somebody can be both of those identities also.
That perspective tends to lead to like these like simmering resentments sometimes, I think, right? Like this idea that, okay, well now like these people are suddenly worthy of our attention and respect. And it's like, actually, like, that I think that leads to more division. And so I know we'll probably talk about it a little bit later in the interview, but for me, like really shifting corporate paradigms around diversity and what diversity offers, I think is so important, because it prevents against some of that sort of like separation and like and this idea that people can be easily slotted into boxes.
Interesting. Well, I do want to come back to that. Could we just kind of going back to your experience as a biracial woman and intersectional woman, also thinking about with intersectional identities, and also thinking about the kind of different layers of racism that many Black and brown people experience, colorism as well. Can you talk about that and why it's important to diversity, equity, inclusion work?
Absolutely. So something that I think is actually tragic that is happening in our society right now is there seems to be this mythology that there are a lot of like Black individuals being sort of like lifted up, right, and being recognized for their achievements and accomplishments. And I think all of those moments are very worthwhile, and people do deserve to sort of like be recognized and et cetera. But I think the idea that there is not this spectrum understanding of race in our country, and that people are sort of labeled as Black without like any regard to nuance or how someone self-identifies or those kinds of things, I think it's to be highly problematic, because there's still there's a lot of research that actually shows that people who are dark-skinned individuals, dark-skinned Black individuals, tend to be far less likely to be hired, tend to be far less likely to get married. Like there are a lot of actual like studies that show that colorism is playing out in our society in such a way that if someone who happens to have a different level of pigmentation than someone who is lighter skinned, right, like goes to a job interview and that person has a master's degree and is more qualified, they're less likely to get hired than their lighter skinned counterpart who has a lesser educational degree, less experience, because there does seem to be this colorism that is rampant in American society. And I think that sometimes like we look at people like Barack Obama, who is like, but not like, I'm so excited that we had Barack Obama as a president, but also I think sometimes labeling him as the first Black president, like it's like, oh great, like look at what people have achieved, which I think is wonderful and beautiful. But at the same time, like, I don't know if his skin color had been different, if he would have taken office. Like there's a lot of colorism that is rampant in American society that goes unnoticed and unacknowledged, and I think it's really devastating to people, and I think it's it's harming all of us, and it's not just in this, like we see it worldwide actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I was struck once, I was doing a workshop with a global population, and someone, I believe they were from South Africa and biracial. And he said that in his country, he's biracial, but considered white.
Yes.
And he came to the United States and was struck by the fact that everybody said he was Black. Like they argued with him. No, you're obviously Black. There's this interesting thing that I think has happened here, and it probably has its roots in slavery and enslavement. And
oh, well, it
that we have,
absolutely does.
yeah.
I mean, it stems from the one drop rule, which was all about keeping people as property. And really it had to do with the fact that white slave owners would rape their Black female slaves, and they wanted those children to then still belong to them as property. So it's rooted in slavery. And there are like very, I think, important reasons why a person would still want to identify with their minority race. And I think if it's if it's a choice that someone's making, or a way that a person identifies for themselves, I think that's really important that we honor that. But I think that, again, like it really comes back to labels should be labels that people get to define for themselves and get to sort of choose what they're called and how the world sort of receives it. Like, I don't know. I mean, I love that you have on your title, she, her, or your preferred pronouns. And so like, I think that's really important that you get to say that, right? And how would it feel to be walking about in the world and have people sort of misgender you? Like, that doesn't feel good. And it's the same thing with race, right? Like it doesn't, and sometimes diversity seems like it might be visible, but it's not always. And I think that the assumptions are really problematic.
Yeah. We have a question from the audience, from Stephanie, that just wanted to clarify colorism. Is it the same as racism or different, and how?
Yeah, so I think that racism, like if you think about it as a rectangle and a square, right? Like not every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is also a square. And I think racism is this term that a lot of other things fit into. And so colorism, it stems from racism. It's a form of racism, but not all racism is colorism. And so just to give like a little bit of a definition of what colorism is, I think the idea of the hierarchy that was put out in the chat earlier is really fitting, but it tends to be the belief that people who are lighter skinned get certain privileges, certain rights, maybe like there's certain, I don't even want to like say them out loud, but like there's certain beliefs that people who have a lighter skin are superior, right? And so there's like this spectrum wherein the darker a person is, the more stripped of their privileges they become, and the lighter a person is, sort of the more privileges they become open to, or that are like granted to them, or the more rights they have to be in certain spaces. And so it's really just this disgusting and ugly practice of ranking people according to skin color, but we see it in our society, and it's happening every day. And I think sometimes this idea that we have in America that like, oh yeah, like if someone's a light-skinned Black person, like, and they achieve something, they'll be recognized as such, but like nobody's talking about the fact that their darker skinned siblings are not having access to those same things. And there's actually a very powerful shirt that came out in the midst of this pandemic when the Black Lives Matter marches were happening more and more. But there's a shirt, and it has a person who's a white person, and it says something like, I think it's a police officer, and it says like, oh, he gets off, like, he doesn't get charged at all. And then it's a white person, it's like, oh, he gets probation. And then it's a light-skinned Black person, it's like, oh, he gets 5 to 10 years. And then it's a dark-skinned Black person, and it says, oh, he gets, life without possibility of parole. And it's actually like, there's a lot of validity to that if you start looking at sentencing and how that's doled out to people along color lines and those sorts of things. So it's really a problem in our society. And I think it's important. And I know years ago, there was a movement where people would say like, oh, I don't see color. And I think that's a huge problem. Like, I think we have to see color, and we have to recognize these things, and we have to acknowledge that they're playing out in our society.
Yeah, and I think that there's several layers of damage that this does to our society and to people's self-perception as well. There's a whole skincare lines dedicated to skin bleaching, and it can really be really damaging internally for somebody. It's something we don't talk about very much, and it's really important to address.
It is really, really important to address. And I think it also is very hard. Like a lot of these things are very hard to address, because how do we address them, and with whom, and what's an appropriate thing to say? And so I don't necessarily fault people for not having these conversations, but I think once you become aware of the importance of the conversation, that is when it is up to you to take that agency and do the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's talk about that. So you talk about we need to go from bystander to upstander, and I think that is really, I love that. What do you mean? What is that? What is an upstander? And
yeah, so the first time I heard that terminology was actually, I was fortunate enough to be able to interview a number of Holocaust survivors, and also to interview students who were doing work on the Holocaust. And some of those students were Jewish students who were like learning about this from the perspective of like, oh my goodness, had I been alive at that time, I might not have lived through that, through this. And so I think it was very deeply personal for them, for obvious reasons. We talk about personalizing things, and so so I had the opportunity to be able to interview these sets of people who had like this very real connection to the Holocaust and to the generational trauma that ensued. And that was when I first became aware that really the vast majority of people who were alive in Nazi-occupied Germany, and who were living during the time of the mass atrocities that happened during the Holocaust and the annihilation of more than 11 million people, most of the people were not directly involved in persecuting Jews or members of the Jewish faith, or people of color, or people with disabilities, because there were a lot of people were annihilated under the Nazi rule. But most of the people were actually just citizens, like you and me, or not me, because I would have, I wouldn't have lived through it. But most of the people were just like ordinary citizens going about their lives, who just said, you know what, like that's not my thing. I'm a bystander. I'm not culpable, but I'm also not going to do anything. I'm also not going to get involved. And so there's a whole body of writing and literature and research that talks about how like those people, the bystanders, are actually the ones who tend to make up the majority of the social collective, and who tend to be the ones who have the ability to, if they will step into that upstander role, these atrocities don't happen, or at least we could stop them a lot sooner. We could get involved in a more meaningful way. We can make change in society. And I think like one of the things that we saw this summer with the Black Lives Matter movement is that suddenly, because that movement had been happening like years and years before, I remember marches and movements and watching TV and seeing people die, but like suddenly in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, people who had been bystanders suddenly became upstanders, and then we saw that actual change started to happen. And so I think it's important for people to, in any situation, kind of ask themselves, am I the victim? Am I the victimizer? Or am I a bystander? Or am I an upstander? Because there are really only 4 options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you are a bystander, you are complicit in what is happening. I mean,
absolutely. And being an upstander looks different, right? So like, I think sometimes people tend to think like, oh my God, like I wouldn't want to put myself or my life at risk. And there are different schools of thought about that, and stepping into the ally zone and being willing to do that. But also like being an upstander can look like just saying, you know what, this isn't okay. Or it can look like if you're at a company and the hiring practices are discriminatory and you notice it, like it could be saying something. It could be being in a meeting and you notice that some of the voices aren't really being heard, and just saying, you know what, let's take a moment to really listen to what this person is saying, right? So it can be subtle or it can be heroic. But I think it's just important that we take some action in the direction of allyship and empathy.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. So you mentioned our workplaces and thinking differently about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the work we do inside our workplaces. What are you thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So my project, the Demystifying Diversity podcast that I created, one of the things that I did like very intentionally was it looks at this season anyways, looks at 10 different topics pertaining to diversity. So it's really a macrocosm of the microcosm. And one of the things that I appreciate, Melinda, about your work was that like I noticed that this podcast in and of itself, there's a recognition of the need for radical inclusion, right? That like it's not just, I interviewed someone one time and she said, diversity is more than just teaching white people how to treat Black people, right? Like it's so much more than that. And so your question was like, how do I talk to people about thinking about corporate culture and about diversity? And the first step, I think, is to recognize that diversity is so much broader than I think we're thought to think about it, right? Like we tend to think about it as just like still this way where identity is still categorical instead of intersectional. So I think the first step is to understand that most of us have a number of different intersecting identities. The other thing then to understand beyond that is that the richness of our identity supports us in supporting our end user, right? So like whether you're selling an idea or a technology or a product or whatever it is, whoever your consumers are going to be, there's going to be a broader base of consumption if you have a number of people with a number of intersecting identities thinking about your end users with a number of intersecting identities. And so first, like I think it's about thinking about, well, how can I be better at serving the community at large? Well, suddenly it becomes very obvious that, well, we need to really see what the community at large needs. And if I just have my own narrow viewpoint and then I surround myself with people who think like I do, I'm not going to do a very effective job of serving a broader community, a broader contingent. And so I think once people really start to see that, it suddenly becomes, oh my gosh, the more diversity, the better. Because if we can get people who have had different lived experiences, who think in different ways, who maybe have different physical and mental and emotional needs or requirements, like suddenly all the people who are making decisions are going to do a way better job of seeing those things that are, in our blind spots that we can't necessarily see. So I think once you start to really think about diversity as, we'll think about your corporation as a holistic entity that has a number of different needs and that you want to support as many people as possible, diversity suddenly becomes essential. It's not just something that you sort of like have to do to check any boxes. And I think once people can have that level of investment and like, oh my God, the more people we have thinking differently and sharing differently with different identities, the better. Suddenly corporations get really, really hungry to hire diverse candidates and to also retain a very rich and multifaceted set of employees.
Yeah. Christina says, yes, you need diverse perspectives to be truly innovative. And yeah, I mean, when you're working to build the most innovative, the most profitable products and services, then, having diverse people working together to solve problems is really key. It's really important.
Well, the thing is too, like, I mean, this is sort of like the negative side, the downside of not having it, but there are a lot of corporate products that really alienate a lot of people, right? Like, I mean, I think there was a lot of stuff written about like, and this isn't my world, so I'm probably going to get it a little bit wrong, but a lot of like video games. There's a lot of research and work out there right now about the way that certain minorities were being depicted in video games in ways that just were not at all inclusive or representative. But if someone, if someone was sitting at that decision-making table, who had the perspective of a member of that community, the end product, I think, would have been way more inclusive and suddenly would have appealed to members of that community. And some of these shifts are very subtle. But I think it's really important to invite diversity because, yeah, you're going to be more innovative and expansive. You're going to apply to a broader contingent of people. And also, like, there's a lot less of having to say, like, oops, our bad, sorry that we did that. Because sometimes I think these things are just a byproduct of, like, not really thinking. And of course, why would you if that's not been your experience and you don't have any frame of reference? And so I think that's why it's so important to sort of bolster corporations in advance so that they're not realizing these things after the fact.
Yeah, yeah. I'm jumping into a couple of questions here. We kind of went into this, but maybe you have some additional thoughts for Fabienne. So what advice do you have for leaders to lean into learning beyond the transactional DEI work and into impactful change that both connects human experiences, creates equitable and inclusive leadership? And I guess the third piece is supports marginalized communities within organizations. It's a big question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can see that in the Q&A, right? Because I want to make sure I hit all the points. So I'm a huge fan of servant leadership. First and foremost, I think that really we need to look at the ways that leaders lead first and foremost, because if people think as a leader that, like, okay, well, my job is to tell other people what to do, then you're really not creating an environment for true diversity. Even if all those diversity boxes are checked, it's really more important, I think, to foster a community where people feel heard and feel valued. And I get that your question was about, like, well, then how do we do that, right? Like, how do we really create equitable and inclusive leadership? And I think the first thing is to give people the sense that you are truly in their corner and that you truly, if you're in a position of leadership, want what is best for them personally, professionally. I've had people work for me and I've actually gotten them jobs at other companies, like promotions at other companies, because I knew that their ability to move up with me was going to be less than their ability to grow in another corporate setting. So I think when people feel like you as a leader, you as an employer want what's best for them, and that you truly do want to hear them, I think that's very, very important. And I think also you asked about supporting marginalized communities within organizations. I think one of the things is for leaders to be very proactive about assessing the needs of people, and when people come to them, like, with stated needs, to just always make it clear that, like, it's your honor to be able to support that person. And so, for example, when I've worked in corporations in the past where, I'll always suggest, like, okay, why don't we have a designated, maybe, like, if it's available, if it's possible, have like a designated maybe meditation space or something, so that a member of a certain faith tradition who needs to go and pray during the day doesn't feel like suddenly they're kind of like singled out, right, as a result of that. Or, like, let's build in, spaces in between meetings so that people who maybe have a disability don't feel like they have to hurry or they're being late. And, like, let's sort of create that prior to people stating that need, so that we have that as a company culture. So it's not, oh, suddenly so-and-so comes in and gets hired, and then we make all these special accommodations for this specific person. Because I think that is very, very problematic. And I think sometimes companies say, like, oh, I'm being so supportive, but really you're making that person feel othered. And so imagine, like, if a person who is a member of a minority community comes in for an interview, or a person who's not a member of a minority community comes in for an interview, and you as a hiring manager are able to say, like, oh, well, we offer this, and this for our employees, and they're able to just feel like, wow, like, so I can avail myself of what's already there and already in existence. I don't have to fight take up space. I don't have to fight for what I need. I think those things really go a long way in terms of retention and just supporting a very inclusive corporate culture.
Yeah. And just as an example, something that we learned after our very first conference in 2015 is that, an inclusive environment is not putting on your website that somebody who's deaf can ask for can ask for an interpreter. Is to have an interpreter there. So if they join, they don't have to think about it. It's just they have an interpreter or a closed captioning or cart captioning. And yeah, just really, really thinking ahead of time, how can you create an inclusive environment where because it's time consuming, it's emotionally consuming to always have to ask. And so the inclusive environment, people don't have to.
Yeah, right. And I think sometimes people don't necessarily want to show up sometimes because it can be so draining in advance to even feel like you have to ask. And then what if there's a no, or what if that's not available, or making people sort of feel like, oh, this is such a burden. I think for me, anytime that someone makes me aware of an area for growth as a leader, my first response, whatever my first response is internally, my first response externally ought to be thank you. Thank you for making me aware of this. Thank you. Because you're not always going to be awoke to what you're not aware of in advance. But I think if someone does ask, or if someone does make a suggestion, it's saying, oh, wow, thank you so much for making me aware of this. Now, what can I do? What can we do to innovate possible solutions? I think that encourages a whole lot more participation. And something else that I know, I've thought a lot about is in corporations, there's actually been a lot of work that states that there are certain voices that tend to often, because of a history of not feeling heard, or because of a history of subjugation, or because of the way that leadership reacts, tend to sometimes not always speak up, right? Because of being shut down again and again and again. So I think notice if you're at a company that is really striving towards diversity, and that thinks you are diverse, also notice who are the voices that are actually speaking up, and which ideas do you tend to run with and support, and who within your organization are you really uplifting? And I'm not saying you should stop uplifting those people and stop listening to those people, but I am just saying maybe think about why you're not as attuned to other people, or why certain people might not be speaking up, and then think about what can you do to create those opportunities.
Yeah, oh, that's a great point. Christina asks, how would you recommend getting a leader of a company on board with diversity and inclusion? That's a common question, right? And how do you get them to commit if they truly don't care about Black and brown people?
Right. Well, I think that's why I tend to believe in the power of selfish investment sometimes, right? So I want to be an altruistic person. I think I have a big heart. I care about other people, but not everyone feels that way. And so something that I feel is really, really important is, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but making that person aware that even if they don't, I wouldn't put it as even if you don't care about Black and brown people, but just making that person aware that the corporation will do better. Corporations that I work with tend to be way more profitable in the long term, because what I find is that if a corporation starts to appeal to a wider demographic, they're just going to do better, even in times of recession, right? If you're appealing to a wider demographic, if you're appealing, if you have different product lines, if you within your company have more diversity, you're actually creating a sense of safety for that company is going to do better, that company is going to be more profitable. And so I think if you can get someone to see that, once they start to see the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, the hope is that then maybe their hearts and minds will shift and they'll become a little more empathetic. But even if they don't, I think it is still possible to create a corporate culture where it is more profitable to be invested in diversity than to not.
Yeah, and there's other data you can use as well in terms of turnover and the cost of turnover, the cost of lack of engagement in your company. Yeah, there are other metrics, other data that could really like help show the business case for it. I guess I believe that everybody has some kind of an access point, whether that's the business case, whether that's, a daughter or a partner, or a colleague, like there's or something else, but there's always some entry point. You just have to find that entry point.
Well, the other thing, it's really interesting. So I sat down with Dr. Howard Stevenson, who's the head of the Racial Empowerment Collaborative in Philadelphia, and he was talking about the de-escalation work that he does with police officers in Black and Brown communities. And one of the things that was really impactful was he told a story about doing this diversity, equity, and inclusion work within a police department that was very hostile. Like people were being forced to take the training and they did not want to be there. And it was very clear that they didn't want to be there. And then he asked, like, well, what would you do, if it was your nephew, like in these neighborhoods or in these communities, if it was your child, like what would you, and suddenly like people were crying and people who had sort of had this stoic attachment to their identity as, police officer. And suddenly they started to be vulnerable and started to like really talk and share, and that sort of machismo culture was stripped away, and like they got down to a really honest conversation. And one of the things that I found, so in my podcast, we look at like different topics related to diversity. And I found that something that's really beautiful about that is that people tend to be very focused on sort of their niche, right? And not see the intersectionality, not just of identity, but also of oppression, right? And so suddenly, if you start to see that like, oh, if we make this a safer, more inclusive space for people of all genders, all body types, all sexual orientations, all racial identities, all levels of physical ability, right? Like if we start to really make this a more inclusive space, it's actually going to uplift people where maybe I do see myself in that community, or maybe I'm not personally in that community, but maybe I have a brother or a sister or a nephew or a niece or a child or whatever it is. And so I think that can be really important too when the borders of these definitions about what constitutes diversity work are sort of expanded.
Yeah. Another question from the audience. Danielle asks, I love the idea of an Upstander. It's a great way to communicate how people can get involved and the impact. Do you have any recommendations for resources to share the concepts with others?
Oh, that's such a great question. I wish I had like a resource at the top of at the tip of my fingers. I know there was some work that the Philadelphia Liberty Museum put out about the National Liberty Museum in Philadelphia put out about Upstanders, and also I gave my information. It's at Daralyse Lyons, or my email is daralyse@daralyselyons.com. And if you will shoot me an email or a message, I will happily send you a whole list of resources, because I have them. I just don't have them at the tip of my memory.
Yeah, and actually what we can do is we can add a few resources to the podcast link and on our website as well. So maybe we can.
Yay. Okay, great. Yeah, let's do that, because I want to think before sort of putting things out there into the ether.
Awesome. Cool. We just have a couple minutes left, and I was going to ask you how people can learn more about your work. So daralyselyons.com.
Yeah. So daralyselyons.com is my personal sort of professional website. And then also, if you want to go to demystifyingdiversitypodcast.com, or search the Demystifying Diversity Podcast anywhere you get your podcasts. That's also a space where you can connect and learn and engage. And I always love to hear from listeners, and especially I wrote a book called demystifying diversity, embracing our shared humanity. And there's also a workbook attached with that. So I think for people who are looking for like tangible skills and things that they can do, and there is in the workbook, there's a guide for how to adapt it for a corporate training, and that kind of thing. So people can absolutely sort of engage in that way. You can connect with me, but I'm really just excited that anyone is here and listening and learning and doing the work, because I think the more we can do that, the better off our society will be.
Yes, 100%. So we checked in at the beginning about how you're feeling now. Or what are 2 words to describe what you're thinking about for 2021?
Oh, well, it's so hard because after this conversation, I feel very uplifted and optimistic. But I would say for 2021, I'm cautiously optimistic. I have a lot of hope for where I think we're headed, but also a lot of caution, because it's not lost on me that things really are pretty dire, and that I think like we all need to tread lightly and softly and with love.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for joining me and having this discussion. I appreciate you and all your work.
Thank you so much. The feeling is so mutual, and thank you for everyone who attended. Thanks to everyone who's listening. Thank you to our interpreter. Just thank you to all the people who are supporting behind the scenes. I think it's really wonderful, the work that you're doing.
Awesome. Yes, ditto. Thank you all for your questions and your conversation. And I just want to ask you all, what action will you take today as an ally and an advocate? So join us each week for Leading with Empathy and Allyship. You can RSVP for future sessions and sign up for our newsletter at changecatalyst.co/allyship series. And please do subscribe to the podcast and the YouTube channel, and give us a review or a thumbs up, whatever platform you're on, and share this with friends and colleagues that could use it. Thanks, everybody. And I'm seeing all the comments, appreciate all of you saying these words. Thank you so much. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day and week and month and year.